G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Best Fiends a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, one of my favourite guilty pleasures is just kicking back and binging through a good TV series. Raised by Wolves was my most recent one. But one thing that I feel exactly zero guilt about is how much I enjoy playing Best Fiends. Best Fiends gives me an endless source of fun that I can access anytime right on my phone. It's a match 3 puzzle game like none other, with literally thousands of levels and new content added all the time. I've actually been playing for some time now and I'm a little obsessed. Okay, maybe a lot obsessed, but I've really enjoyed the levels and puzzles, especially some of the boss levels, and I've been playing with my kids lately, which has been a lot of fun. We actually started a new game to get the basics down, and now that we've done that, my kids and I play most afternoons as a bit of a treat after homework. I think I've been playing it casually for like a year now, and I'm a little over 900 levels in my own game, and I'm still finding new elements to the game. But I must admit, starting again and playing with my kids has been a lot of fun too. And I think what I love about Best Fiends the most is that it's a fantastic boredom quencher. It's great for casual gameplay and moments of downtime throughout the day, but I also love that more levels, events, challenges are always being added, so the game never really runs out of things to do. The game is free to download, and with Best Fiends, there's something new today, and tomorrow, and every day after that. So if you never get tired of solving puzzles, good news, with Best Fiends, the fun never ends. So, download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. This happened around 2001 when I was 21 or so. I was a college student living at home. My house was on a quiet downtown street in a college town. I'm not a sleepwalker per se, but sometimes when I'm really tired, it takes me a few minutes to really wake up. Within those first few minutes, I'll often go about my business, almost by habit I think. I've gone to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, etc. before fully awakening. And one afternoon, I was home alone and taking a nap on the living room couch. My doorbell rang. It felt like a part of my dream almost, and the next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the vestibule, a little room between my porch and the front door, talking to a strange young man. I have no memory of getting up and answering the door, to be honest. But he was young, late teens or early 20s, clean-cut and dressed normally. Nothing stood out about him. He was holding a sort of stack of something. He was in the process of explaining to me that he was part of some rehab program that took minority, low-key offenders from troubled backgrounds and helped rehab them by teaching them life skills. He and others were out that day selling magazine subscriptions for their non-profit. At first I told him that I wasn't interested, but he was really friendly and wouldn't back down. He was polite, but definitely pushy. I finally told him that I would look. While thumbing through the catalogue, though, I became aware of him moving closer and closer to me. All the hair stood up on my neck. He was really crowding me and invading my personal space. I didn't want to be rude. I know. But I just shuffled backwards towards my door until the knob was pressed into my back. But what made me really uncomfortable, though, was what he was saying to me. He kept going on about, this is a really nice house. How can I get me a nice house like this? Finally, to get him to leave, I wrote him a check for a subscription service, but just as I was starting to close the door on him, he put his hand in and asked for a glass of water. And it was at that all my antennas went straight up. I knew not to let him into my house, but he'd moved forward to where we were almost touching. His hand was on my doorframe, blocking me from leaving the vestibule. I could only move backwards, and when he asked a second time, I said, sure. And then before he could react, I said, be right back. As I quickly backed in, shut the door in his face, and set the deadbolt. Watching him from a window, I actually heard him curse, ball up my check, and then walk away. He got into a dark sedan that was parked maybe a half a block down my street and driven by another young guy, I think. And despite how he was supposedly going from door to door, None of my other neighbors were approached. Also, my check was never actually cashed and I never got my Cosmo. To be honest, I was actually a bit afraid that I may have totally overreacted, but at the time I just didn't feel comfortable at all. My upbringing, I suppose, was totally fighting my instincts, but since then I've learned enough to know that I might have been really lucky that night. So I was around 5 to 7 years old when this happened. I lived with my mum and my two sisters. I would see my dad on Wednesdays and Saturdays. We lived in a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house next to a funeral home. I used to share a room with one of my sisters, and when I'd wake up in the middle of the night, I would always run into my mum's room and sleep with her because I was scared. So, I come home one night from my dad's house. After a short while of being home, probably 20 to 30 minutes, I decide that I'm going to act like I'm sleeping in my bed, and when my mum comes to check on me, I'm going to scare her. So I crawled into my bed, and for some reason I just immediately passed out. I woke up at around 1:30 in the morning, I think. I ran to my mum's room, as I always did out of fear. I don't know why I was always scared in this house at night, but it was every night. I got in her room, and for some reason she's not in there. I checked the living room, and she's not in there either. I then realized that she probably went to stay the night at her boyfriend's, I think. I immediately booked it right back into my room, though, and I jumped into my bed. A few minutes pass, and now I'm even more scared because I remembered that my sister, who I shared a room with, isn't here either because she stayed the night at her friend's house. After probably 5 minutes, I think, I start to hear pots and pans banging in the kitchen. When I heard this, I went under the blankets right away. This goes on for another 10 minutes, and the whole time it's happening, I'm pinching and punching myself because I was convinced that I was dreaming, which I soon found out that I wasn't. A few minutes after, the continuous noise stopped. I came out from under the blankets, and in the hallway, directly across from my bed, there's a man hanging there in my sister's room. I can see his head, but I can't really see the rest of his body. I think he's wearing a blue tucked-in dress shirt, black dress pants maybe, and black dress shoes, I think. Right after I saw that, though, I think I was just kind of scared into pure terror, and I went back under my blankets, and eventually I passed out again. I told my mum and my sister about it the next day, and they were really freaked out. We moved out approximately maybe 6 months later into my mum's boyfriend's house. Now that I'm 18, turning 19 soon, when I think back on when this happened, I think that there was something from the funeral home, considering how it was dressed. It's weird though, because my friend's grandma lives in that house now, and they haven't experienced anything. All I know is that that memory, it's going to stick with me for as long as I live. So I was in sophomore in high school when this happened, and I haven't gone back. It's midsummer in New England, and my best friend, his name's Andy, and I are just hanging out. I live on conservation land, so aside from the houses at the very front, there are pretty much no other developments, and woodland that spans for acres and acres. The state put down some paths, so I suggested that we go exploring one day. We geared up, I brought my pocket knife, sprayed down on bug spray, and headed out my backyard. Now, we hadn't explored too much, but I did know the area somewhat well, so we decided, to heck with the trails, we're going to be real men and forge our own path. We enter the woods, thickly forested with pine, maple, and oak trees, and make notches in the trees on the way so we can find our way back. It's around noon, so I'm not too worried about it getting dark. After all, the sun sets around 8 p.m. in the summer. but just in case, I keep track of it. We walk deeper and deeper into the woods, about 15 minutes, and the forest just seems to come alive. Bugs, frogs, birds, everything in this forest is loud. Slightly irritating, truthfully, but it's nice to take in the sights and the sounds, I suppose. But soon we stumble upon a peculiar scene. A perfect circle, probably 20 feet in diameter, that spans from the ground all the way to the sky. I'm perplexed, but Andy is curious, so we decide to go in. The first thing that I noticed, though, was that the overgrown weeds and the grass that surrounded us, they stopped at the perimeter. All vegetation past the line is just dead. Not bare, but just dead, crunching under our feet. I don't just mean the grass either, but the tree limbs that extended in there are also bare. Like leaves down the branch until it crosses this line, and then they're just dead. Being the middle of summer, nothing should be dead, and I've never seen a branch behave like that, to be honest. It was at this point, too, that I'm beginning to feel an extreme unease. I turn to Andy and ask him if he feels uneasy, and he says that he feels like we're being watched. I agree. And it's then that we notice the strangest sense that I've ever felt. The entire forest immediately goes silent. Not in rest, but in what feels like maybe suspense. Whatever the case, I'm feeling extremely uneasy now, and I know that we need to leave. We run out of there following our tree marks, and when we get back to my house, the forest is back alive. Ever since then, too, every summer, every winter, a snarl of branches, sometimes leafed and sometimes not, sort of reveals a path through the forest there. I swear, too, that whatever was watching us from that circle that day, it continues to watch that path around that time of year. My buddy B and I have been fox and coyote calling for some time now. If you're familiar with it, you place a sort of wiggly fake critter somewhere, play some distress calls or mating out loud, and when the time is right, you take a shot. It sometimes happens quick, it sometimes happens within 10 minutes. Anything longer and you move on to the next area. So, this night, however, we came across something that, well, it scared me half to death, and we've avoided that area since. We were set up, jump in the back of a pickup truck and start calling. We already got one grey fox each at this time, and we're hankering for another. Only this time, the wood is really quiet. I remember my buddy mentioning how creepy it was as we set up. After about 10 minutes, we turn the caller down and listen, looking around. There was nothing. He turns the caller up slightly, and out of nowhere, we hear the most primal screech or call or sort of cackle that I've ever heard. It was like one of those bird calls from the jungle, but it's really hard to explain. In any case, we freeze. I can see in my peripheral my buddy's eyes wide open, eyes darting back and forth, because like me, I thought it came from behind and above us. But the primal fear my body felt wouldn't allow me to turn around. B turns down the caller. The fake critter is still spinning and flopping around. We're basically looking at each other in our peripheral vision to see if the other heard it. And then there were these two huge whooshes, what sounded like heavy wing flaps. A couple of branches above us rustle and snap. We both turn a 180, aim our rifles at the same spot in the tree above us. We have red light spots, lights on our rifles and headlamps too, only to see the branches slowly stop moving and a broken one swinging. Then there was a thump or a crash. We both turn another 180, rifles fixed on the area they were before. Only, instead of a fake floppy critter, we see this massive... All I really made out, to be honest, were, well, there were wings, a huge, leathery reptile thing. They were sort of like huge wide bat wings. I'm still not sure, but we turned around just in the time to see this thing jump off the ground, flap its wings to gain altitude, and it was gone in a flash. And to be honest, all I can really picture is something like Batman from, well, the animated series. B and I sat there, rifles aimed, staring straight ahead, wide-eyed, breathing heavily, not sure what just happened or what we saw. But 30 seconds later, about 100 yards ahead of us, our fake floppity critter drops from the sky, landing on the side of the road. It was mauled, mangled, and crushed, and with a final sort of screech off in the distance, it was over. We wait about another 30 minutes and retrieve the caller, and then we just skedaddle right out of there. To this day, we've convinced each other that what we saw was some sort of a ginormous owl. Even if we joke about seeing something like pterodactyly, there's still a serious minute where we basically tell ourselves to just shut up. It must have been an owl. And we actually took a break from calling for a bit. So, years later, still hunting, trapping, and calling, I now carry a harpoon gun with me every time and any time I enter my local woods. Whatever that thing was, it owes me a fake floppy critter, and in turn, I hope to hunt it and put it in my trophy case. So I was just driving home from a morning shift and was about a kilometre out from home when this guy stepped onto the road in front of me, waving his arms and shouting, "Stop, please stop." I slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting him, and he ran to my window. I've had similar things happen before when people need help after an accident, and I assumed that that's what this was. I ran down the window, and this guy said, please help me, I'm being attacked. Please get me out of here." And I, being the credulous soft touch that I am, said, "Sure mate, get in." Now, I spend a lot of time in my car, and my front passenger seat is basically my office, and covered in just everything. So, not thinking, I told him to get into the back. This was lucky. So, this stranger is now in my back seat, and I said, "Can I take you to the police station? What can I do?" And he said, "Yeah, a police station, please." So I pull a U-turn and head to our nearest cop shop. Luckily, it's only about 6 kilometers away. At this point, I still think this guy has been legitimately mugged or something, and I ask what's going on. "There's people after me. There's one there hiding in the bushes, and another one there on that side of the road, up in the tree." There's obviously no one there, in either the bushes or the tree, and I think to myself, oh no, I've picked up a person in the middle of a psychotic break with gang-stalking delusions. "Okay, mate, well, let's get you to the police station and get you sorted, alright?" I say, trying to sound reassuring and calming, and he seems responsive and says, "Thank you so much." Police station's just out on the main road, only takes us a minute to get there. And man, I have never wanted a cop car to appear in my rearview mirror so much in all my life. But only 2 kilometers to go now. We drive in silence for a minute when he suddenly turns his head on his side, looks at me, and says in this super deep growl, "You're not taking me to the police station, are you?" "Yeah, mate," I say. "Sure I am. We're almost there. Just hang on, alright?" "You're one of them, aren't you? This was your plan, wasn't it? I'm getting chased and you just happened to show up at just the right second? Where are you taking me? Let me out!" He starts thrashing around in the back seat, pounding the cushions with his fists and flailing wildly. And just then, we come around a curve, and there is the police station. "No, mate. Look, there's the police station there. We're turning in right now, okay?" And we did, and he calmed down. He said thank you and ran inside as soon as I parked. I gave him a few minutes to tell his story to the cops, then went inside and told the desk sergeant what happened, just for context. I don't know exactly what was going on with this guy, but man, I'm so glad that I was close enough to that police station to get there in time. So before I begin, this guy has been fired, and this whole story took place months and months ago. So, I was hired to work at this auto shop as the front desk receptionist. My guy friend had worked there and had gotten me the job. I checked customers in, checked them out, answered phones, entered voices, blah blah blah. Now, at this time I got hired, I was freshly 15. I do act mature for my age and all that stuff, but I was still technically a kid. I was also the only girl working there. Now, my two managers, their names are Peter and Alvin. Peter was my main boss, and he had a dry sense of humor, but he was cool to be around. Alvin was more openly humorous, and he was pretty pleasant in general, I suppose. And then there was this third guy. His name was Chester, and he was 40, with a girlfriend, as well as a 13-year-old daughter. He was very exuberant, very loud. He was quite funny. He was a bit annoying too, but this isn't the right place to talk about that. Anyway, it started off decent enough. He would tease me like a boy on the playground, like pull my hair, poke me, stuff like that. I laid my rules down when I first worked there. I hate being touched, and that was that. Now, Chester would get close to me as he humanly possibly could and say things like, "I'm not touching you," and laugh. It was annoying, but I just laughed it off, although I did feel uncomfortable. Then he started with kind of sexual jokes. When we were alone up front, he would talk about things. My brain was automatically like, this ain't right, and I just kind of put on my customer face voice whenever I was around him. But then one day, I baked the whole garage cookies, and when I dropped them off, he came really close to me and sort of sniffed me. He said, "You smell good, and your hair looks nice this way." I was like, what? Did he just, do that? When I went back to work, he was going on and on about the cookies I made. He said, "I know cookie is another term for something inappropriate, but I really like your cookies." Why even add that, right? Anyway, now is my breaking point. He had started brushing his fingers against my leg when I'm sitting down, or just trying to flirt with me in general. When I came into work one day, he grabbed me into a hug, and my mind just sort of blanked. He grabbed me into a hug so I couldn't escape. Eventually, I pushed him back away from me. Alvin had rounded the corner and had seen what had happened, and he looked a little bit uneasy. I went around the other side of the counter, away from Chester, and I said, "I don't like being touched, dude. Don't hug me." And he said, "Well, touch is how I show my affection." So, not only did he ignore my attempt to tell him to stop, he also admitted to literally giving affection to a 15-year-old. I later heard from my friend that works in the garage that said Chester talked about the way that I looked and how I look older than I am, but that he doesn't want to start anything because his daughter was 2 years younger. Start what, though? Chester was ugly, and, he was old. Anyway, Alvin had seen him grab me. The dudes in the garage heard him talk about me, and I knew this dude was, creepy to say the least. A guy in the garage, his name was Steve, pulled Alvin aside and told him that he was worried for me. He told him what Chester has been saying and how he looks to be flirting with me. Before this point, Alvin had thought that he had been too overprotective because he had daughters himself, and maybe he was just having his father instinct or something. But when Steve told him that, it basically confirmed all of his suspicions. Chester was super gross and potentially evil. I ended up speaking to Alvin near the end of the day, asking to stay after to talk to him about something. We stayed after, and I opened up to him about everything Chester had been doing. Alvin said that what I do is more important than the work that he does. After that, I went home and felt nice that my boss cared for me like a human and not just an employee. Peter, my boss, texted me to tell that everything's going to be okay and that he will be handled. I ended up meeting with Peter's dad, who was the big boss, to tell him everything. It was very much, we've known Chester for a long time, etc., but Big Boss is a good man. He trusted my word more. I told him everything, and he actually had camera recordings of Chester grabbing me too. And after that, Chester was fired. I think the most traumatic thing to me, though, was how Chester talked about me in the garage like some kind of an object. It was honestly disgusting, and then going back to the fact that he's 40 and I'm just 2 years older than his daughter, man, it was disturbing. I'm sure that if I wasn't such a confident person that he would have taken advantage of me. He was very much acting like a predator, and I'm really glad that he's no longer a part of that establishment. Anyway, I guess the moral of the story is, guys, teach your daughters to speak up when people make her uncomfortable. Even the little things like weird jokes turn into something bigger sometimes. That's how it was for me anyways. Always enforce your boundaries and never ever let a guy get away with being a creep. So when I was young, I was super into the paranormal and would read as many true life accounts as I could. Nowadays, the X-Files and the odd horror film are as involved as I get, but I would still love to believe these things happen. I also really love science though, so I struggle to accept these things exist. That being said, this is definitely the craziest thing that has ever happened to me, and I've never had anything like it before or since. It might have just been a night terror, but anyway, here's what happened. A few years ago, I'd been ill for a couple of days. I literally never get sick, and it was a running joke at work that I'd never taken any sick days. I'd been feeling a bit groggy though, and had a fever, so was finally off work for a day or two. Anyway, the night in question, I remember being woken up because my bed was going up and down like a seesaw. I was super disorientated about what was actually happening, but it also seemed like the bed was in the air for this to be happening. But quite aggressively, there was a definite seesaw motion. That I remember. There was also a kind of whooshing or a rushing sound, and the best way to describe it, that I can think of anyway, is the white noise equivalent of light, if that makes sense. It was basically a total sensory overload. I was lying on my back trying to figure out what was going on, and my left arm was at a 90-degree angle to my side, stuck rigid against the bed. I remember looking at it and thinking, oh no, I can't move. It was almost anchoring me to the bed as all this was going on. And suddenly, my back goes rigid and I slowly sit up to a seated position in a perfect sit-up motion. Except I can't do sit-ups like this. There's no way that I have the actual physical capability or core strength for that moment in the way that it just happened. At the same time, my head is tilted right back and my jaw is locked open in like a silent scream. I don't remember being scared because the whole thing was just really disorientating. I was pretty exhausted in general from being unwell, so fear seemed to require too much energy. But I remember the head tilt and the jaw lock and really stretching my physical capabilities in these moments. Then, as suddenly as it had began, it all goes silent and dark, the bed stops and I just flop back down. But just for a moment. Because then the bed and the noise and the light all start again, except this time both my arms are stuck to the bed, so I'm lying in a sort of cross position. I remember thinking very vividly that if I can get my arms free, the whole thing will stop. This was like the only moment of clarity in the entire experience, along with the less defined knowledge of something very bad causing this. I don't know what it was, of course, but all I could think was that, or maybe feel is the better word, is that this thing was very bad. There was also a less defined knowledge of a good force being around, and freeing my arms was what I had to do to win this battle, as it were. Eventually, I managed to yank my arms free of being stuck, and at that moment, everything stops. And then I have a very brief moment of being a bit worried or panicked before I literally pass out, and I guess go back to sleep. Now, I've had dreams and nightmares lots of times, but I've never had anything like this happen before or since then. It was an entirely different experience, and I thought maybe a hallucination or my fever breaking, but it was just some next level crazy, that's for sure. I also don't know if a fever breaking or a hallucination can do something like this. I'm inclined to believe that it was just a hallucination or a hyper-realistic dream, but I wasn't that ill, and I've definitely been a lot sicker without the bizarre experience. Anyway, who knows what it was. Maybe it was just a night terror, though terror wasn't really a prominent feeling. Maybe it was a visit from an unfriendly something or other. Maybe it was aliens. I don't know, but I would like to hear what you guys think. So I was 15 when this happened. I was laying in bed watching TV. I had the house to myself as Mum had went to get groceries or something. But when the credits to the show that I was watching came on, I saw in the reflection of the black screen someone standing by my doorway. The moment that I saw this figure, I froze. I was completely paralyzed with fear to the point that my head started heating up. I felt like I was about to faint, to be honest, but somehow I racked up the nerve to turn my head and see if someone was actually there, and to my relief, there was nobody. I guess I must have just been seeing things, or so I thought. I went back to watching TV when minutes later I received a text from my neighbor letting me know that Charlie, my dog, was out on the street. My neighbor is really old and has poor eyesight, so I assumed that he was mistaking Charlie for another dog. Nevertheless, I looked around to confirm that Charlie was indeed missing. After calling his name and receiving no response, I stood up and headed downstairs towards the living room, as Charlie likes to rest there, and on my way I noticed the front door was open. When I saw this, I instantly got chills. It was at this moment that I realized that the figure that I'd seen earlier wasn't just me seeing things. I immediately proceeded to walk out the door, but as I proceeded, the sound of footsteps running down the stairs could be heard from my position. I bolted out of there as fast as I could, and I ran straight to my neighbor's house. I told him what had happened, to which he responded by calling the police. The police came to my house, and they inspected the place. They couldn't find anyone, except for a switchblade that the intruder must have dropped as he bolted out of the house upon hearing the sirens of police cars about a mile away, I think. I think back to this day quite often, and I often think that if it wasn't for my neighbor's text, I'm sure that I would have made the headlines that evening. I'm a security guard for an alarm response company. We answer alarms for businesses and private residences. 99% of the time, it's just a motion detector set off by a cat, or a restaurant forgot to disarm their stuff before the stock truck arrived to unload. Just stuff like that. But in this case, I was called out to a house where the back door alarm was set off. Like, it thought that someone opened it. The owner was out of town, but she was alerted by her app and had her mother meet me there. We checked the door, and it's locked. We figured that maybe someone tried the door, but it didn't budge, setting off the alarm. But there's a light on inside. The mum mentions this to the daughter on the phone. The daughter says that she isn't sure if she left the light on or not. It's a good idea to make people think someone's home, but she just isn't sure. But that gave me a bad tingle. The mother wanted to go inside to check. However, she didn't have a spare key. The neighbor did, but they were asleep and Mum didn't want to wake them. So I fill out my papers and go back to my normal patrol route. But an hour later, the same home sends out an alert. I'm the only one in my city zone, so I answer it again. And when I pull up, police and CSI are there talking to the mother and the now awake neighbor. They're reviewing the video footage sent to them by the daughter. I look at the footage, and 4 armed men wearing masks and hoodies came out of the bathroom a minute after the mother and I left. They proceeded to rob the place. They had broken in and locked the door behind them for appearances, and they were the ones who turned on the light. The mother told me 3 guys had robbed her daughter's home about a month before this. Somehow they knew when this girl was going to be out of town. They appeared smart, desiring a quiet robbery without conflict. But they did bring guns, so they were prepared to shoot their way out of trouble if need be. Now, the mother had wanted to go in, and if she had had a key or woken the neighbor for the key, we would likely have been shot dead by these guys when we went inside. Work doesn't give me like Kevlar vests or anything like that too, so it's pretty much guaranteed a death sentence. If I ever get another house call and someone is in there, I am not going inside no matter what is asked of me. I count myself fortunate the way this place was blocked this time because I was prepared to foolishly go in and check if I could. I will say though that the 1% of calls where something is actually off, it's never been as bad as this one. I live in Finland, in a fairly small city, and this happened to me a year ago when I was 14. So, it was a Friday evening, and on every Friday our mum lets us go to the store and buy some candy. So me and my 12-year-old sister left our house to go to the store, and it was already dark outside. We made our way to the closest store, which was over a mile away. While walking at some point, there's a man behind us walking the same way, but I didn't think much about it at the time. He could just be going to the same store after all. So I continue chatting with my sister while the man is behind us, following us at a safe distance. We get to the store with no complications, and the man followed us into the store. We take our time selecting our candy and get to the register to pay. While I was packing the candy into my backpack, I saw this man buying only a chocolate bar. It was a pretty far way to go for a chocolate bar, I thought, and at this point, my suspicions start to rise about this guy. I leave the store with my sister, and we start making our way back. We walked for a while, and I quickly glanced at my back, and the man was still there following us. I took a look at my sister, who seemed totally unaware about the man's presence. We continued our walk, and up ahead of us was an unlit dirt road that continued for a good part of the trip, so I look at my back again, and there the man still was about 60 feet away. At this point, I was almost certain that he was following us because on our way to the store, he didn't walk this part of the way behind us. The dirt road goes through a forest, and it had a curve at the start of it. Once we got to the curve, I look back and notice that the man can't see us, so I quickly pull my sister to the woods and we duck down in there. My sister is saying something, and I just whisper, "Stay quiet," to her as I wait for the man to come by. I could see the man's shadow sort of coming down the road, and he started looking for us from the road. He walked back and forth on this road a few times, and now I was certain that he was following us all that time. My heart was racing like you wouldn't believe, and I tried to be as quiet as possible. Thankfully, the man didn't find us, but continued running forwards. We stayed in the forest for quite some time before getting the courage to come out again. We walked the rest of the way home with no problems, and we get to our house. We eat our candy and have a good evening, but that really did bother me for a while, and especially my sister too. Thinking back on this still gives me chills, and the thought of getting caught in that situation, in the middle of the woods with no one around, it really creeps me out, and I try not to think about it too much. I know for a fact that that guy was up to something no good, and I'm just glad that I had the intuition to step into those woods when I did. So, it was the summer of 2004. I was 15 at the time and working weekends at a skate park, running the registers and keeping up shop. I was the only female employee there. The reason that I got the job, I thought at the time, was because I used to hang out there a lot prior to being offered a position. Now, they used to host events and sort of rock shows a ton. Those were extremely fun and the place where all my friends gathered for a good time, so we got to know the owners pretty well. The two guys that owned the shop were in their 40s, overweight, balding, typical older white guys, but they were extremely nice. Their names were Doug and Mark. Doug was always more serious about the business, always trying to come up with ideas to better it and rarely joking around. He was also married with kids. Mark, on the other hand, seemed like Doug's minion, I suppose. What I mean is that he was usually out running errands, making calls, or cleaning the shop. He was a single guy, he was very outgoing and silly, so we always had fun with him around until, well, one day when the fun just stopped. Before I tell you about the scariest moment of my life, I think, I'll inform you of the events, or I'd like to call them red flags leading up to it. So, on one occasion, we were hosting a show where a local metal band was playing. There were lots of people there, kids and adults alike. They were skating and running up and down the ramps and the bowls and stuff, just generally having a good time. Then Mark suddenly came up behind me as I was talking with my friend Katie, and he all of a sudden just picked me up and swung me over his shoulder and started tickling and spinning me around, right in the middle of this crowd. I laughed it off and was yelling for him to stop in a sort of giggly way, but I was honestly a bit creeped out by that, as he had never touched me before, even in a friendly way. Even at 15, I found this pretty inappropriate for a man in his 40s to be so touchy on me like that. But after about a minute, he put me down and was laughing and apologizing. To be honest, I didn't think much of it because, like I said, it was in a crowd, and thought maybe I was just overreacting a bit. A week or two go by, and I noticed Mark was giving me sort of flirty looks and sticking his tongue out at me when he was around. Again, I didn't think too much about it, as he was a nice guy. I thought that he was just being funny. One day, though, Mark called me into the back. We had 2 doors right behind the register that led into our stockroom, as Doug sat at the register on a business call. When we got to the back room, he picks me up, sets me on the washing machine and tells me that he wants to kiss me. I automatically shut him down, obviously, but he then tries to persuade to lift up my shirt. At this point, I'm really freaked out, and I'm just hoping Doug comes through those doors any second. Again, I firmly tell him no, as I hop down and proceed to walk to the front of the shop. That's when Doug opens the door and asks, "Hey, what are you guys doing? Did Mark show you our butterfly collection?" I just responded with, no, and I walk out. They both follow me. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful, and I just wanted it to end. Now, I usually got off work at around 6 or 7, but around 5, Doug asks me to go to Mark to run some errands. He jokingly said, "Take my credit card, but don't give it to Mark." All I could think about was how awkward this ride was going to be, as we hadn't talked since the incident earlier that day. I was really dreading this trip, to be honest, but I had no idea what was about to unfold. So we get in the car, drive to my high school, which is on the other side of town, in a medium-sized sort of busy city, but about 5 minutes away from my house. And as we pull in the back parking lot on a Saturday, I ask him what we were doing here. He responds by saying, "I'm scouting out an area for a skate park. It's behind the school here." And this is when I start to get nervous, but hoping it's true, because I did know that they were trying to expand locations at that time. He gets out of the car and motions for me to get out and come along. I hesitantly do so. We start walking to the back of the school, and he's just talking about his visions of the new park and stuff. Nothing too serious. That's when we approach the woods, though. Not a wooded area, too, like straight up dense forest-like woods. Ones you could barely walk through, in fact. And that's when he says, "Take my hand, come on, I'll show you the spot." And this is when the alarms went off in my head, and I realized that I could be in real danger if I go with this creep. In my head, I'm contemplating whether I should run or just go along with him, because I didn't know which one was about to make my situation worse at the time. This pondering seemed like it went on forever, when in reality it was probably only a few seconds. But thank God that I paused a second before making any decisions, because that was when my cell phone rang. I honestly forgot I even had it on me. It was my mum asking me if she could pick me up early so we could go to dinner. That's when I tell her with a sense of urgency, yes, I'm at the high school, come and get me, now. I think she could hear the fear in my voice too, and left immediately because she was there in less than 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, I tell Mark that I have to go and wait on my mum. He seemed agitated by that, but agreed and walked me to the front steps of the school to wait. He didn't say bye or anything. He just suddenly, sort of briskly walked away to his car. My mum shows up a couple of minutes later. I hop in quicker than I've ever done anything in my life, and I know that I must have been shaking. I tell her that I'm not in the mood to eat and just drop me off at home. She asks me if I'm okay, and I said yes, and that me and a co-worker were just there scouting for a new spot. I get dropped off at home eventually, and I think I'm just in shock and full of fear. What I did next was I quit working there that very day. I just never went back. I didn't explain anything to anyone, and I've only told my boyfriend and a couple of friends about this. But I'm 100% convinced, looking back on all of the red flags and the fact that Doug didn't seem to trust Mark. Doug actually seemed like a good guy, that if I had went into those woods, I wouldn't be here today. Who knows what he would have done to me as well. It's weird when you survive something like this. It's never really seemed real to me, I suppose, but it very much was. These days, I actually have a 12-year-old daughter myself, and I try to teach her about safety and predators all the time. This kind of experience, it changes you, and it changes the parent that you become too, I think. An update to this, though, was that about 2 years later, Mark called my house phone. I don't know how he got my number too, and told me that he was in Istanbul, Turkey, and about to open a skate shop there. I just said, please don't call me anymore, and I hung up. Luckily, my nightmare was over after that, but hearing from him was honestly like talking to the devil or something. In any case, I hope that that guy is in jail so that he can't hurt anyone else. I've always wondered if Doug ever found out about Mark, and if maybe Mark had to flee the country for a crime that he committed, landing him in Istanbul or something, because going there in the first place seemed weird. Anyway, this turned out a bit longer than intended, but the point is, as a woman or a girl, especially, never trust anyone who's been a creep to you. In fact, I don't really trust much of anyone anymore. To tell you the truth, I really don't remember exactly how old I was when it happened. Probably 6 or 7, I think. I know that the war that was raging in my homeland had finally come to an end because my father had finally returned home, which had brought a smile back to my mum's face. They were finally able to visit relatives at the other end of the state, those that survived, that is. And while they were away for the week, my grandmother looked after me. So that night, I was lying on my mattress in my little room trying to fall asleep. And just as I was drifting off to sleep, Maximilian, a dog that we had, started barking loudly. In a split second, the door to the room opened and then closed. And all of a sudden, I couldn't move my body at all. In fact, an unknown face could be seen through the outlines of the darkness. That figure, which now also had a body, sat on my chest and began to choke me. I couldn't breathe. Blood gushed from its eyes as it repeated over and over again, "I don't want to see, I don't want to see." It was a woman's voice. Filled with just horror, I somehow managed to pull myself out of her bloody grip and rush toward the light switch. I quickly turned it on, and when I did, there was no one in the room but me. I am drenched in cold sweat. I want to scream, but no sound is coming out. And that's when I noticed that there was black smoke suddenly coming out of thin air, and it begins to fill the room. But no matter how hard I try, I can't open the door too. The smoke takes on what it looks like the form of faces or something, but the light is on. How is this possible? After looking at these faces for some time, eventually I just lose consciousness, I think. I wake up, curled up on the floor. I feel drained and really scared. Well, I just can't really explain it. Was it sleep paralysis? I don't know, but I'm convinced that I was wide awake when I turned the light on. Maybe I was losing my mind for a moment or something. I don't know, but let me tell you that when I think about it, it definitely messed me up for some time afterwards. This is an experience that I've kept hidden for years because, well, I know how crazy it sounds. I've dealt with this particular experience for a majority of my life, mostly in dreams, but it began in real life in front of my own two eyes. And while I am an avid believer of the supernatural, or other beings that aren't on this plane of existence, I have a hard time believing myself on this one. I'm sure that that's normal though, right? Anyways, I'll go back to the night that it began. I was in 4th or 5th grade and I went into bed for the night. A quick description on the layout of the room at the time too. My twin bed was on the right corner with 2 windows on the opposite wall, one directly parallel to my bed. So, as I crawled into bed and got comfy, I looked across my room and through my window, which was covered by purple sheer curtains, and I saw the shadow of a man looking through my window at me. This shouldn't be possible though, as my room was on the 2nd floor. While looking at the shadow, I kept trying to find its flaw that revealed the fact that it was fake, but I just couldn't find it. I kinda just stared at it, trying to make any sense of it, and eventually I just dozed off and made it my mission to look outside my window the following morning at the bus stop to see if any objects could possibly create a shadow like that. I got outside of my bus stop the next morning, but there was nothing there that could have created it. And every night for years, I had the same nightmare where I would go into my room, the curtains are open, and he yells at me and kills me. And that was usually right when I would wake up. Years went by, and I eventually stopped having them, thankfully. However, the summer after I graduated high school, they returned. Way more complex this time, too. Every time I would have this dream, he gets closer and closer to me. He's always waiting for me in the shadows, or he's chasing me. I had sleep paralysis in college, and I had a similar feeling during that I have during these nightmares with this shadow. And I guess that I'm just trying to see if any of you guys have any ideas on what this could be. Why am I seeing it? Why am I so scared of it? Is there anything that I could do to stop the fear and the nightmares? Also, it's probably a good thing to mention that I haven't seen this figure with my own 2 eyes since the first night, years and years ago. I'm 21 now. I've thought about the possibility of it being a shadow person, but for some reason it just doesn't seem right. The shadow was very clear and had a precise figure, unlike the stuff that I've read up on shadow people. However, I will happily admit that I'm just not that educated on the matter, and so I just try not to think about it too much. This happened a few nights ago, and I just really can't stop thinking about it. Now, I work in the criminal justice system, and I see a lot of crime, and I'm also naturally a follower of subreddits, scary movies, and scary stories in general. So I kind of have to disclaim that I do have a heightened sense of paranoia sometimes. That I'll admit happily. But my girlfriend and her roommate both agreed that this was just really weird. So I was out walking my girlfriend's roommate's dog as she was working a night shift in their neighborhood, which is a very safe suburb of New York. I walked across the parking lot into this field in the middle of a rotary, or a roundabout, whatever you call them. I lived in Boston for a while, and they call them rotaries there, and was just sort of screwing around in Reddit since it was nearing midnight and in the middle of quarantine and there were no cars out. The dog has a long leash, and so she was sniffing around, and then I kind of saw her stop and stare towards the road. I looked up, and I saw a black SUV stopped in the rotary. I pulled on my COVID mask that was on my chin. Since nobody was around, I had it sort of half off, as some people in New York are pretty touchy about that. Understandably too, just in case they stopped to lecture me, and I didn't care to engage in a dumb argument. I looked back at my phone, and then back at the SUV that was still there. There was a family, mother, father in the front, and a 12-year-old daughter in the back seat, and I was a bit startled because they were all just sort of blankly staring directly at me. I sort of waved and nodded and started walking the dog a bit around the grass again, and they started to slowly move. They came around the rotary, and I looked back, and all of them were again staring directly at me. I figured that they may talk to me, so I stopped and waited for them to sort of get around the circle, but when they approached, they kept driving very slowly or staring directly at me still. I gave another half wave, and they drove past me, still slowly and staring, back around the circle, then again around the circle, literally all of them blanket staring at me, even the little girl in the back seat. I put my arms up in like a shrugging gesture as if to say, "What are you guys doing?" They did this a couple more times, and I started to walk up to the edge of the circle to engage. Normally something I would not do, but it was a family, so I sort of felt a bit more brave to do so. They sped up a bit and went around the corner and turned off the rotary. I started to feel even weirder, so I decided that I would walk back to her apartment building when they entered the rotary again. I was sort of watching them out of the corner of my eye, and they were still staring. I started picking up the pace, and they turned off the rotary towards me and picked up the pace as they followed me. Once again, I got to the sidewalk, and I turned around because I didn't want them to know which door I was walking into. It's on a strip mall with a few other apartment buildings and stores. And they stopped about 30 feet behind me, and they were all staring out the front window. The little girl was in the center seat, now staring too. I once again raised my arms to be like, "Can I help you?" And no response at all from them. I just kind of stood there with no movement, and took my phone back out and typed their license plate into a notepad. Again, a weird thing that I do, probably because of my work in criminal defense and general paranoia, not really knowing what I would do with it. Then they slowly turned to the other side of the parking lot, all still staring until they got to the end of the lot, and I rushed into the apartment building, which luckily needs a code to enter. I got up and I told my girlfriend, and then her roomie in the AM, and they both were kind of freaked out. I watched them out of her window too, and they pulled back up to where I was standing on the sidewalk and just sat there in their car for some time. I couldn't see them at this point, but the roof of their car, and it felt like maybe 10 minutes that they just sort of sat there, and then they just slowly drove away. I really just can't stop thinking about that creepy stare at me too, because somehow it made it creepier that it was just a normal-looking family with a young daughter. If it was like two younger guys, I could have marked it off as if they were bored and just screwing with me, but this was just blank, unmoving expressions that made it so creepy. So I usually take my dog for a walk every day. Today, my dad said that he was going to the gym, so I decided to take the dog for a walk while he was still there. So I lock the door and leave, going on my usual route. On my way, I pass a large section of forest or bush. I don't know what to call it. I've always noticed a path that leads into the bushes, though, but I've never bothered with it because the usual walk is already long enough. But today I decided that I would because I wanted to see new places to walk and my dad would be out for quite a while. I really don't like being home alone, so I thought, well, why not? So I start going along this path and it just seemed like a normal bushwalk, really fun. At that point, I thought that I might actually go there again, in fact, tomorrow or whenever I walked him next. So I'm walking along this path for about a minute or two until I came to what I thought was a dead end, because the path ended and there was bush coming up to my knees where the path would have continued. So I go to turn around and head back and I see something moving. It's in the deep bushes, not too far from the knee-high bush and about 10 meters away from me, I would say. From what I could see, too, it had really long, thin arms. It was pale. It looked like it was sort of hunched over, sniffing the leaves or something on the ground. And my dog made a whimpering noise and tried to chase it, and the thing looked straight up at him and just bolted. It ran further into the bushes until I couldn't see it anymore. As it ran, I noticed that it had really small legs, probably about half the length of its arms, in fact. I got out of the bushes as fast as I could, and after that, I just ran home. The thing looked very humanoid, though. I just want to know if what I saw, has anybody else seen anything like this? It's almost a year now, end of August of 2019 to be exact. I moved to an apartment in a different city because my mother, who I lived with in my hometown, passed away from cancer. I've moved here with my long-term boyfriend and one other roommate, who has been a good friend of both of us since before we had even started dating, in fact. We all absolutely love it here. The location is great. It's a 15-minute bike ride to and from my university, and it's located at a square with a grocery store, a drugstore, lunchrooms, all that stuff. So we pretty much have everything we could possibly ever need to survive within walking distance. However, after just a month or two of living here, someone has started to ring my doorbell at exactly 11:05 p.m. semi-regularly. Sometimes every day, sometimes every other day. Sometimes there's like a week in between, and sometimes there's a couple of weeks in between. But it's always at around 11:05 p.m. And every single time I get no answer each time I ask through the intercom who it is. Except for one time, but I'll get to that in a bit. At first I thought that maybe it was friends from one of the neighbors who accidentally rang the wrong doorbell or something. But after around the fourth time, I grew suspicious. And after more than those 4 times, I started noticing that it always happens at either exactly 11:05 p.m. or a few minutes earlier or later. My boyfriend and roommate both work at bars, and so they work until very late and would usually only get home at around 2 a.m. So each time it happened, I was always alone at home, and it started to really freak me out after a while. When I first told them about it, they kind of shrugged it off and said that it was probably just a wrong dial, like I thought at first. But when I told them that it has happened so many times, sometimes even daily in fact, they didn't really believe me at first, and thought that I was just a little bit paranoid and spooked. However, one night when the doorbell rang again, I answered the intercom asking who it was, like I always do. But this time, I heard very heavy breathing. I was thoroughly spooked at that moment. I was again home alone and kept asking who they were and what they wanted. I couldn't make up my mind from the breathing if it was a man or a woman too, but I heard a sort of strange mumbling or whispering, and then it just was dead silent. They appeared to have just left. I had put my apartment door on a double lock after that because I was really scared and really spooked out. Thankfully, my roommate got home a little earlier that night, around 30 minutes after the doorbell rang, and he could tell how upset I was. Now, with the coronavirus and all, my roommate and boyfriend aren't actually able to work anymore, and they too now have also witnessed the frequent door ringing at 11:05 p.m., so they now believe me and agree that it's really odd and very creepy. We also have a balcony that looks down at where our apartment building's main front door is, but because there's also a shop right underneath us that always has those curtains or roof things out, the view to the door is sort of partially obscured. Every time our doorbell rang, me, my boyfriend, and my roommate would go to the balcony to see if we could see anyone, but we never could. I've also asked my neighbours from my apartment building if their doorbell also gets rang so often, but the ones that I've asked all said that that's never happened to them. So 2 weeks ago, my roommate decided to do some investigating and went outside our apartment building at 11 p.m, standing across the street and pretending to have a smoke while keeping an eye on the door. He said that he did see a man who looked kind of suspicious wandering around our apartment building, who slowed down his pace significantly as soon as he approached our door, but when he spotted my roommate looking at him, he quickly walked away. We obviously aren't 100% sure if that is the door ringer, but that was very, very suspicious. Our doorbell hasn't rung at night since that day too, and I'm hoping that maybe it will stop now, but I guess there's always the possibility that it will continue again, perhaps in a few weeks. So I grew up a latchkey kid, parents not home until after 5 and so on. One day after school, 10 years old, I was sitting at the dining room table doing homework when I hear a very firm knock at the door, like the kind that the cops do. Our elderly neighbour knocked like this when he would come over for whatever reason, so I got up to answer, assuming that it was him. I was very much taught and learned and trusted by my father to have access and use my shotgun if ever necessary for self-defense as well. I was also as well versed in self-defense, as much as a kid could be, I suppose, and uncommonly fearless at that age. So I opened the door to reveal what appeared to be an 8-year-old boy with sandy blonde hair, looking straight down. He was wearing a yellowish but sullied shirt under a grey zip-up hoodie, which was really dirty as well. It was late spring in the south. I knew most nearly all the kids our age in our neighbourhood and from our school as well, but I just didn't recognise this kid at all. Not relegating myself as the pinnacle of knowing everyone, I figured that he was just a friend of one of my neighbourhood friends' little brothers or something. So I said to him, "Hi, can I help you?" And with a very assertive tone, he said, "Let me in. I need to eat something." Baffled by this kid's gall, I said, "Do I know you?" When this time he barked the same thing with a little more gusto. The effect, though, was sort of flat and then empathic, reasoning and then flat again. Something was just really weird about this kid. So I asked him if I needed to call his mum or anything, and same answer. So then I asked if he was friends of so-and-so, but no response. I tried to make a little bit more of further small talk with him, chummily tapping him on the shoulder and whatnot, but then I noticed that this kid was like literally as hard as steel. The whole time his gaze was sort of fixed downwards, so I leaned in to get a look at his face, and when I did, I noticed that his eyes were like completely dark purple, almost black in fact. I asked him if he'd been in a fight, and no answer. By this time, my alert sensors were up and running, thinking domestic abuse, by his seemingly sullen and brash attitude and all that. I started over to get some crackers, and on the way an alarm went off in my head, and I thought, why is not his entire orbital area the same color as his eye? After grabbing the crackers and turning further to question him, in mid-sentence, I looked again at the doorway, but gone. That admittedly would have been easy to do in my area, and this is where it gets really weird. All of a sudden I could hear something. Maybe the kid, or I'm not sure, but it was in my head asking somebody else, why didn't it work? It didn't work. I really didn't know what to think of that, but I then brushed it off as just a really weird experience. Fast forward to 2014 though, I was 39, bored as heck one night, so I decided to read about the black-eyed kid phenomenon. And then the memory hit me just like an anvil hitting my head. I was really freaked out, to say the least. In fact, I haven't been the same since. Luckily, too, I actually imparted this to a friend when it happened, and he actually remembers me telling the story to him as well, which means that it definitely happened, and I don't think that I'm crazy. So this happened around 4 months ago, and I'm a 14-year-old male. We have a Burmese mountain dog called Ava, who is 2 and weighs around 120 pounds, so she's really big. She's a quiet and a pretty lazy dog, but also seems to be alert pretty much at all times. So one night, my parents were out for dinner and left me at home with Ava. I was downstairs just watching some TV, and my lounge is right next to the front door. Around 8 p.m, the door rang, and I opened it to see a guy in fairly plain clothes just standing there, and he told me that he had a delivery here. I was confused because, well, he didn't look like a delivery driver to me, and he didn't have any parcel either. Suddenly, I turned my head, and I see another guy around the side of my driveway, which goes to our back door, and he starts to walk towards the back door. I freak out, and the guy at the door notices this and barges through shouting for the other guy. And this is when Ava wakes up and begins to let out the loudest bark that I've ever heard her make, making the guy stumble back. She rushed towards him and jumped up, grabbing his shoulder and literally throwing him out the door pretty much. His buddy came along but saw Ava and just hightailed it out of there. The other guy managed to slip out of Ava's grip and ran down the road, and I managed to get Ava to stay, so I didn't lose her, and they got away. I was so shook up that I rang my parents and then the police, and I gave them a statement. Safe to say that Ava got plenty of treats from then on, and these days I always keep her nearby when I'm on my own. This is a bit of a weird one, I know that, but I would still like to share it. It happened to me when I was around 12, and I still get chills just thinking about it too. So I was sitting in the backyard of my grandparents' house. All family were inside. From around the side of the house, a child began skipping past me right in front of me, probably about 3 meters away. But this child was see-through, although it had sort of a bubble-like appearance. It had a golden outline too, and I still remember the detail of the outline between its fingers. It skipped away and slowly faded. I went back inside, really confused. I told my mum later that night before bed, and she mentioned that she's had many paranormal experiences in my grandparents' house too. My grandparents did unfortunately lose a child at a young age, so I always thought that it just could have been her. But another weird thing about it was the figure skipped in a way that was almost identical to my sister. She was only a child at this point too. Could I have witnessed some form of a shadow of a memory, or possibly a parallel universe overlapping with ours where my sister was skipping? Whatever it was, I'll never forget it. Glitch, paranormal, or a 12-year-old's brain just playing tricks. What do you think? Let me just start off by saying that I'm 18, and I'm graduating in less than a week too. And the first 2 of these instances happened during the first semester of this year. So my first semester I was taking an intro into law sociology class. As you can imagine, my law and sociology class tends to get very politically heated very quickly. Usually it's your typical heated debate about Trump or something. But there was one kid with really suspicious political views and opinions that really stood out to me. His name was David. David used to constantly talk about guns, like obsessively. Also about how he thought that everyone in the US should be wiped out and the country should restart as a traditionalist authoritarian empire. Yikes, I know. I had known David from middle school as he hung out with my friend group as we were all pretty much goth and art kids. We all didn't like him though, but I remember that he used to make weird comments and really dark and sort of morbid jokes that made everyone really uncomfortable. Yes, even the goths. I'm talking like really weird sort of gory jokes about murder and stuff like that just sounded like they came straight out of Jeffrey Dahmer's personal notebook or something. But fast forward to law class. We have a school cop, mainly for drugs, who visited our class one day to talk about students' rights and stuff like that. And he's taking questions from the kids and whatnot. It's all things like, do you have a police dog, and how many jewels do you confiscate in a day? Until David speaks up. Not to mention that he'd also been playing illegally downloaded Skyrim on his school laptop for the past 10 minutes and wearing one of those weird sort of hentai sweatshirts that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Right off the bat too, David asks, how likely is it that a school shooter would be caught, and what kinds of guns do you carry in the event of a school shooting, and how many cops usually surround the school to catch the shooter if he escapes, and do you check social media for suspicious activity and stuff like that? Yeah, real predictable and sus stuff, right? Now, fast forward to a couple of weeks later, I hear from one of my close friends, Julia, that David was being sent to the correctional school in our district. When I asked Julia why, she said that David had not only attempted to rape his girlfriend, Julia's sister, but ran off with his dad's pistol when she said that she was calling the feds. He then barricaded himself in a bathroom at a local gas station. I don't think she ever ended up calling the feds, which kinda sucks, but finally, this was the creepiest part. So about a semester later, my mum shows me an article of our local newspaper saying that it's about one of our former students. She's a teacher. When I look and see, of course, it's David again, and he's being arrested for attempted murder this time, for bashing in the skull of his elderly neighbour with a hammer after offering to help him in the garage. He's thankfully okay though, which I'm very, very grateful for. Needless to say though, if you ever get bad juju from someone like I did with David, it's probably a good instinct to trust your gut. To start off, I'm a male and 17, and I'm not a strong believer in the supernatural by any means, nor the paranormal or anything like that. But as of yesterday, I really no longer know exactly what to believe. You see, I can recall vividly an experience that I had when I was 7 years old, which I always just believed to be an episode of sleep paralysis. I was sleeping in my mum's bed with my older brother and my mum. At night, the room was quite dark. However, the curtains still let some moonlight in, so I could easily make out the shapes of objects within the room. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night one night and seeing a woman just standing a couple of meters to my right, facing me, wearing a long and flowing white dress, almost like a bridal dress maybe. I was frozen for a few seconds, which to me felt like an eternity. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, until suddenly I was screaming at the top of my voice and breathing heavily. My mum and brother woke up immediately. My brother went back to sleep, but my mum stayed up comforting me and asked me what had happened. She held me tightly, so I cried myself back to sleep eventually, and after that I had a very sleepless and pretty much restless night. But yesterday, we were watching a couple of videos that we had made back at that house, reminiscing of those times together as a family. I asked my parents if they remembered the aforementioned event, and described it once again to them. My mum then told me something that she had never told me before. She said that she didn't want to say anything at the time, but now that it was long behind us, she felt that it was fine to tell me. Because, on the night of the incident, she claims to have seen the same woman. The reason she asked me what I had seen was that she had also seen something in the corner of the room, and when I described what I had seen, she knew that she saw the same woman, the same dress, in the same corner of that room. She said that she didn't tell me at the time because it wouldn't have helped me at all, but she also didn't sleep that night, and she held me tight in her arms out of, well, her own fear, and in an attempt to comfort both me and herself. To be honest too, I just haven't stopped thinking about it ever since then. And I mean, it can't be just a coincidence that we both saw this woman on the same night in the same place, right? I don't know. But what do you guys think? This all happened at the end of January in 2019. I live in a small city in Germany, and I just finished my 3.5 years apprenticeship as an electrician. We were at the official ceremony in that city, and then went into a pub after that to continue celebrating. My colleagues and me were drinking until like 4 a.m. before I made my way home. I left the keys to my home in my car, so on my way home I wanted to stop by my car to get them. I started walking from the pub to do this, and I noticed 2 people were following me. I recognized their faces from the pub before, but I thought that maybe they just needed to go the same way or something. It's a pretty safe city, and I'm like 6'5", so I never really had problems with somebody there. After another few 100 meters, I was pretty sure that they were definitely following me, and I was proven of that when they started to shout for me and basically are next to me at this point. Drunk guy 1 says, "Hey, who are you and where are you going?" I say, "I'm calling a taxi to be driven home." "Where is that home?" "What were you doing here?" "We can wait for the taxi with you." Sorry, I'm pretty tired and I just want to go home. I don't know you guys too, so it doesn't really make sense to wait for the taxi with you." After that, the dude stopped at the crossing, and I kept on walking just for drunk guy 1 to run after me, grab my collar, raise his fist, and ask me something like, "What exactly is your plan for life? You tell me now exactly what you have planned in your life. I can see that you make a lot out of your life. We take you with us to station number 5. They show you how you can live your life. They showed me too." Now, even though I'm pretty tall, I've never been into a fight, and I didn't want to try on 2 guys at once for my first time. So basically, I started telling him my plans for life, without many details, trying to talk my way out of this situation. To my relief, the other drunk guy, number 2, started telling drunk guy number 1 that I have a plan for my life and that he doesn't have to worry about my future until guy number 1 let loose of me and hugged me after like 20 minutes of this encounter. I had 110, which is like 911 in the States, typed into my phone, but also didn't really manage to call them. In the end, I managed to get home safe without much damage, and I guess it was just some misled soul that, in his drunk mind, thought that he would help someone. But I'm pretty sure the encounter could have gone a very different path pretty quickly if I hadn't handled it the way that I did. I've stopped going longer distances like that alone at night now, since I really don't want anything like that to happen again. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing alright out there and have a great day. Stay safe. Where I'm currently living, Birmingham, UK, I've now been off work for 2 months, so every day is just walking and exploring the area around me. On Friday, I met up with my brother and we went for a walk, walking over the bridge across the motorway, M42. We look down and see a sort of a small slip road barely visible, and sure as heck, it's not on any GPS map, Apple or Google. Cool, we thought. So we head down to have a look down there. It's a public road. No entry signs. Around 2 minutes in, my brother says, "Hey, I keep seeing those things up there. What are they?" I look up and he's pointing straight up at what looks like a camera obscured by man-made foliage. We walk back a little bit and there are loads of cameras monitoring every section of this area. Another 2 or 3 minutes down the road, and a cyclist comes from ahead towards us, an older woman, around 45 or 50 I would say, with greying blonde hair and a blue summer dress on. She stares at us as she cycles past. We watch behind us as she goes past, and about 100 meters away she stops, turns the bike around, and just sort of stares at us. We think that she's probably just a weirdo, so we walk on. Another couple of minutes go by, and a man walks past carrying a dog lead in one hand and a stick in the other. But the strange thing is that there's no dog, though. Not one went past, none behind him. In fact, we never actually saw any dog, and not one even in the open woodland around us. But as soon as he walked past us, and this is by far the weirdest part, we heard him say, "Still here." At this point now, me and my brother are thinking, what the heck is going on here? We turn a slight bend, and at the end is a giant driveway to what looked to be a great estate that was demolished like 150 years ago. The weeds are overgrown, the roof is collapsed, walls now rubbled on the ground. What looked to be an exquisite entrance at one time was still standing. The tiles on the wall, and plumbing pipes of an ex-bathroom with no fixtures, and everything was covered in sort of black and white floor tiles. And that was it. Behind it was a giant body of water cutting it off from the rest of the area. We couldn't really go anywhere but back where we came from. Which is weird too, because, well, we have no idea where the cyclist and the dog walker came from, and why they would even be down here on a road that you need to go down the motorway to access. I don't know, maybe they were just there for a walk or a cycle or something like that. But it was a weird experience, and something that I think I need to go back and explore further. So first things first, I think we need a little bit of context for this story. My old house was pretty pumped up on security. We had finger ID, passcodes on doors, cameras pretty much everywhere, a automatic security system that could call the police or play fake. The cops have been called, blah blah blah. In other words, we thought that we were pretty safe. This story happened a few years back though. My dad noticed sort of a weird looking man pretty covered up lurking on the street just outside of our house one day. We didn't think anything of it, since sometimes you get the occasional drunk or high person just wandering around anyway. But this man started to inch closer to our house, first being on the opposite side of the street, and then before we knew it, being basically on our property. We just sort of watched him to see what he would do. I'm pretty sure he got bored and walked away and just forgot, but then we started to hear strange noises coming from downstairs, where our front door was. We decided to switch on the camera, and sure enough, this guy is banging on our door trying to get in. Then he looks through a window. He gives up and then starts to go around the side. There was a set of stairs that led to the upper area where we were. He starts to head up the stairs, which sent my dad to go out of the side of the house where he was with a knife and scream at him. This guy runs and we don't see him again. End of story, right? Wrong. So this guy comes back again. I guess that he saw that the car was gone from the driveway or something. My dad had actually gone to get something, leaving me and my mum there, and he looks around. We didn't want to confront this guy, obviously, so I had the idea of playing the fake cop alert that could be heard outside. So we played it, and as soon as this guy heard it, he ran like his life depended on it. We never saw him again after that, and we never want to. But what makes this story much, much creepier is, on the news later it was showed that there was a guy who lurked around houses and was actually killing people in the area, and that he'd been arrested. And I got a good look at this guy's face. I'm pretty sure that it was the same man who was at our house. When I was in 8th grade, neither of my parents would be home when I got home, which was alright because I had my own house key. It was a pretty far walk from the bus stop to my house though, about 10 houses away, and I was the only one who would walk in this direction too. One day, I reached my porch and I'm looking for my key in my bag, and all of a sudden I see a guy who I didn't recognize coming up my driveway. He stops about 15 feet away from me and asks, "Hey, would you like to meet my daughter sometime? She looks about your age. You can come to my house and meet her now if you want." No thank you," I say nervously. "Are you sure? She's really sweet, and we're ordering pizza later." He comes closer. I waste no time. I pick up a rock from the flower bed, and I hurl it. A perfect hit, too, right in his forehead. While he winces in pain, I throw another one, and this time, he actually drops unconscious. I go into my house, call emergency services, and an ambulance and police arrive shortly after. The ambulance takes him away, and police ask me what happened. I tell the full story. I tell my parents about the incident when they get home, too. They're obviously shocked, but relieved. Eventually, we get in contact with law enforcement again and find out that the man was actually likely the pedophile who had been kidnapping other girls returning home from their bus stops. And apparently, I'm the only one of those girls who was alive today. If I had actually not injured him, he might still be on the loose today. And for that reason, I'll never feel bad for throwing either of those rocks, even if they might have killed him. So I'd gone to visit my friend in the psych ward with her mother. Of course, I'm not going to actually name the place, but they were very strict with their rules for the safety of their patients, and the visitors too, so I wasn't actually allowed to see her because she was heavily medicated, and also I wasn't on the list of approved individuals who could see her. I was told to wait, and since I didn't want to sit in the waiting room, I decided to head outside. The lawn was pretty well maintained and peaceful. There was only really a gardener outside, just chopping some hedges towards the left, but he was pretty far away. Apart from him, I couldn't see anybody else on the lawn at the moment. There were a couple of chairs around, though, so I decided to sit down and wait for around 10 to 15 minutes, when one of the receptionists came outside. She told me that she took a little break and was in desperate need of some fresh air. They were apparently running short on staff or something, so she would work extra hours and would also make rounds with the caretakers. We had a nice little conversation about a cat that was walking around and how she was an absolute sweetheart, and all the staff there adored this cat. I then proceeded to tell her about my uncle's cat that bit my toe for pretty much no reason, and we had a pretty good laugh at that. She was about to say something about a vacation, I think, that she had planned soon as things eased up at work or something, when she was cut off by this very intense, shrill scream. We both turned our heads to the lawn where there was this little girl, no more than 12 or so, frantically trying to scratch away this caretaker who was with her. The instant that I looked at her, too, I just got chills. And you know, it's really hard to explain this because I didn't feel threatened or anything, but it was just a really strange feeling. The girl was in her greyish hospital gown, of course, and was literally screaming on the top of her lungs and lunging towards the caretaker guy trying to get him away from her. Now, all this while the guy just stands there, unfazed by the screaming or the scratching. He just stands, not even moving. Imagine someone trying to attack you and you just sort of stand there with a blank look on your face. And that's what this was like. I was actually about to point this out to the receptionist, that how odd the guy is when she darts towards this girl. She holds both her arms tightly and starts to say some words to the girl over and over. I couldn't make out what she was saying. It didn't even sound like a real language. And she mumbled a lot too, but the girl had finally stopped screaming, although obviously still panicked. This whole time, the guy just stands there, not even helping the receptionist calm the girl down. After all this ordeal was over and done with, the receptionist walked towards my direction with the little girl's hand clutched tightly. She was clearly very disturbed and all wide-eyed with tears running down her face and some drool too, absolutely terrified. But the receptionist had a strange look on her face as if I'd seen something that I wasn't supposed to, and gave me a very sort of apologetic smile as she passed by me and took the girl inside. And it hadn't even been long enough that I looked at these two that when I looked back at the lawn, the guy just wasn't there anymore. He just disappeared within such a short time that it seemed impossible. I was pretty shaken up myself by looking at how petrified the little girl was, but I got up and went into the lawn looking for the guy. I mean, it made no sense how first he was acting so strange and then just completely vanished into thin air. Anyway, when I looked back at the entrance, I saw my friend's mum coming out, and while I was looking at her and searching my pocket for the car keys, I got a tap on the shoulder which almost made me jump. It was the gardener, who must have realized that he'd scared me, so he chuckled a little bit, and then without me saying a word, he just said, "Hey, don't worry about the man. He just comes and goes. Sometimes scares the patients here, not on purpose, but what can I say? Some are just rather sensitive." And then he looked over my shoulder and gave my friend's mum a warm smile and turned around. I was just too shaken up to even find the words to explain what happened to her on our way back. I'm staying at this Airbnb currently for a total of 8 days, 5 down and 3 to go. Due to the fact that I'm moving states and have spent almost all of my savings on moving vehicle rentals, vehicle registration, and an apartment down deposit and rent, I needed to be quite frugal on where I stayed before my apartment became available. I wasn't expecting glamour within this cheap Airbnb, but I also wasn't expecting my experience thus far. I am no skeptic to the paranormal, I'll be honest. I've had my fair share of experiences for sure. In fact, perhaps you've heard some of my other stories. I've done a lot of research on surrounding places that I've been, and mostly blame my travels for my interest in these topics. But despite this, I've never had such a just horrible, terrible, off-putting, and malicious experience, ever. So, the Airbnb, it's in a neighborhood that's rather woodsy. It's a studio-ish apartment with a separating wall to make somewhat of a bedroom. It's on the same block that the train tracks run through, above your head. The bridge goes over the street out front, so the train is really loud. But the first thing that I noticed was just really bad luck and lots of it. Before I got to the Airbnb, but after I'd reserved it, that's when it all began. For instance, the job that I had lined up actually fell through. Then 5 interviews later, I still got no job. Not to boast, but I interview pretty well. I'm a pretty well-kept person, and my interviews have gone pretty well. But my vehicle, a 2018 model, is having mechanical issues all of a sudden. Luckily, it's under warranty, but still. My dog, who was staying at my parents' house, needed surgery 2 days ago, and the apartment complex pushed my tenancy a week due to repairs at the very last minute, hence the Airbnb. Secondly, I have insomnia that I manage well, but I'm no good at sleeping through the night or falling asleep in the first place. But here, when I go to bed, this sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but fog seems to fall over me and I fall asleep almost instantly. While I'm asleep, I'm cognitively aware that I am in fact asleep, but I feel like I'm lucid dreaming and have strange dreams of the walls falling to the ground, leaving me laying surrounded by the furniture in a really strange forest. Strangely too, the other houses are gone in this dream, but the train is still there. It feels really dark and intimidating when I'm sleeping too. And sometimes there's a dark cloud above me just hovering inches from my head. And third, activity, experiences, events, whatever you want to call them. For instance, the floors creak when you walk, but they've been creaking when I'm not walking though too. The bedroom window opened by itself one night while I was sleeping. I can also feel someone behind me while I'm cooking and have my back to the room, but the absolute worst part of it all, the totally unexplainable to me, is that I've been touched, and not softly. The first time was on my right leg just above my knee. It was actually broad daylight, and I was folding laundry while standing next to the bed. I heard the creaking like footsteps that I mentioned before, and I ignored it. Then it happened again, only louder this time. I ignored it again. The floor creaked again, and then it happened. It felt like a fast, hard pressure above my knee, and it scared the absolute life out of me. I actually audibly yelped, and I had no idea what had just happened. That is, until I looked at it when I took my jeans off that night. There was a clear handprint consisting of a thumb and 2 fingers. I've also been touched 2 other times at this point, and it's been 5 days here. These instances, too, have also left bruises on my other leg. I don't have the money to rent a different place for these last few days. I just have to wait this out, I think, but I don't know what to do. This feels just very different than any other experience I've ever had, and I'm thoroughly not okay with it. I'm really at a loss at how to face this, and if you guys have any ideas for me, then please let me know in the comments below. This happened about 15 years ago, but to this day I still cannot live on the ground floor of a building. When I was 15, I was staying at my mum's house for the weekend. My parents are divorced, so it was just me and her. It was about 12:30 in the morning, I'd say, and I was just chilling in the living room watching TV while my mum was asleep. The living room had 2 windows that faced the front yard, and I often left the curtains open as the house was set back from the road. My mum's house was not in the best part of town, but I'd always felt relatively safe there. While I was watching TV in my pajamas, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, though, from the window that was closest to me. It was only about 4 feet away, and it was only just for a second, but I turned and looked out the window, and the man's face was staring right back at me, smiling the most hideous grin that I had ever seen. I was frozen, and for about 20 seconds, just sat there with my eyes locked on his. Suddenly, my panic set in, and I leapt up from the sofa and tried to run to my mum. I slammed my leg right above my knee into the wooden coffee table and fell to the ground, my leg feeling like it was jelly all of a sudden. I scrambled up and shouted for my mum. My mum came running down, half asleep, wondering what the heck was wrong. I started stammering that somebody was at the window watching me. Just as my mum was starting to realize what I was saying, we both heard someone attempting to open the front door to the house. Me and my mum both stood still, thanking the stars that it was double locked. But then when it stopped, my mother looked horribly grave and just whispered, "The back door." She turned and bolted through the house, scrambling to turn the deadbolt on the back door in the kitchen, and then she backed away. She then ran to her room and pulled a baseball bat from beneath her bed that I knew that she had kept there because she was a woman living alone. Frantically, she asked me to call the police, which I did, whispering to the operator that somebody was trying to get into my house. We then saw a shadow approach the back door quickly and trying desperately to open the door, kicking and grunting while they were trying to get in. My mother then shouted, "I have a bat and I'll kill you if you try to get into this house. We've called the police and they're on their way." The person on the other side stopped and was still for about 30 seconds before turning and running away. My mum and I just sort of stood in the middle of the kitchen for the 20 minutes it took for the police to actually get to us. The whole time my mother had the bat raised and ready to strike. When the police finally came, they looked around the house. They found that the flowers outside the window were trampled and there were several cigarette butts on the ground outside the window where I saw the man. Mind you, nobody in this house smokes, and the police assumed that he had been there for a while. They didn't find him, and they took my description, but we never heard anything more about it. My mum moved away from that house a year later, even though we never had another incident. I now live in another country with my husband, who wonders why I have no desire to own a house and love living in high-rise apartments. These days, I also pay for state-of-the-art home security, and I always have a baseball bat in my closet, just like my mum. I have no idea what would have happened if my mother had not realized the back door was unlocked and had beaten the man to it, or if for some reason my mother wasn't there that night and she worked late or something. I don't know if the man thought that he could just overpower two women alone, or if he was just trying to scare us. I don't know what his intentions were, but whatever that man had planned, I pray that he didn't find somebody else who forgot to lock that back door. Around 10 years ago, I had gone on a short hike in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, around the base of Mount Glastonbury. It was just a short day hike that I had planned to find the old railroad bed and check out the remains of the old ghost town there from the 19th century. I had gone before with a group of people, and it was a beautiful hike with water and culminates with a great view of the area from an old fire tower. Thankfully, I wasn't completely alone and had brought my dog, Beeb, a 3-year-old Rottweiler, with me. She was good company too for a trip like this, and I was glad to have her along. So I parked on an old logging road and found the path of the trail that would take me to the abandoned railroad bed that is now buried deep in the woods. I was a mile or two in and almost to the railroad bed when I heard something. It was whistling, the kind someone would use to call a dog. Instantly, Beeb looked up and tried to bolt to the right of the trail where the sound was coming from. Luckily, I had a good hold on her leash and stopped her from running off. She barked in the direction of the whistling, but I got her to sit and the whistling stopped. Perplexed though now, I had a strange feeling. Even though I couldn't see who was whistling, it just felt like it was directed towards Beeb and somebody had tried to separate me from her. I wasn't sure what to do, but after a minute or two of no sounds, I dismissed it as just a coincidence and I continued on our walk. Not even 10 steps later, though, I heard a woman's voice from the other side of the trail. "Hello? Come here. We're just off the trail." Then I heard what sounded like the playful laughter of another woman. The tone of the calls were playful, almost seductive. "Hello? Come down here. What's your name?" I was curious and even a little intrigued to check it out. The voice was very pleasant, but after a split second, I stopped myself from moving. Looking to the left where the voices were coming from, I could almost see a path through the trees, down the ridge, a perfectly straight line. But all of a sudden, there was just no noise, not even the rustling of leaves or the chirping of birds. It was dead silent. It was at this moment, too, that I started to feel lightheaded and really confused. Beeb barked again and I snapped out of it. A feeling of complete dread then just overtook me. I reached into my pocket and pulled the Ruger I had in my pocket holster out and held the pistol to my side and clicked the safety off. And as soon as I did that, I began to hear things again. The rustling sound of leaves, birds tweeting, just everything came back to life. And looking to the left again, the path that I had just seen before was now gone. After that, I decided to end my hike, and we booked it back to the car without incident. But the strangest thing was yet to come. When I got back to my car and drove off the mountain and had cell phone service again, my phone had been blown up with missed messages from my girlfriend and brother asking where I was and why I wasn't back yet. I was kind of confused by this, but I checked the time on my phone and it was 4 p.m. I had started my hike around 8 a.m., which means that I'd been gone for 8 hours and could only account for maybe a couple of hours. To this day, I still have no explanation of what happened, and I just scratch my head at it all. I also don't hike anymore either, and instead, I just took up some golf. So this happened at my college years back now. I went to a college that was integrated into a big city. So even though there was a campus, there were plenty of shops, back streets, public transport, and just regular people walking around. I was a part of a club that went late into the night, and I usually only stayed till about 9 or 9:30, and would then leave, usually with a friend too. The club was in the centre of campus, while I lived east of it, so it was about a 15 to 20 minute walk. And this particular night was a foggy late fall, early winter night. My friend left early because they weren't feeling very well, and I ended up staying late and began my walk close to 10:30. I started walking down a back street that was quiet but led right to my dorm, and it was only a few minutes later that I heard footsteps somewhere behind me. I stopped, thinking it was a jogger, and moved to the side to let them pass, but then I noticed that there was no one coming and the footsteps had stopped. I watched for a little bit, sort of weirded out, but in the end I just sort of shrugged it off and I started walking again. Then the footsteps started up again. I stopped and it stopped. I started to get a bad gut feeling, and I quickly walked to the side street that connected the back street to a bigger main street. This street had a lot of lights, plenty of cars, and still a good number of people in it. I walked back to my dorm from there, and the next morning I woke up and checked my emails. One of them was from the campus alert system too, because apparently an hour after I'd got back to the dorm, someone was stabbed on that back street. The victim was rushed to the hospital and survived, thankfully, saying that the perpetrator followed them down the back street before just stabbing them. Sadly too, the perpetrator was never actually caught. But I have no doubt in my mind that that was the person who was trying to follow me. I'm just really glad that I trusted my gut that night. And after that, I always made sure to never stay at the club past 9:30, and to always leave with someone who was at least walking in the same direction as me. I'm female, and when I was 15, my mum, older sister, younger brother, myself, and our dog Betty lived in a really rural area. To give you an idea of just how rural this was, the local school had a roll of 12 kids from a surrounding 150-kilometre radius. It's a long story how we ended up living out there in the first place, but thankfully we weren't there for too long. But not far from us was the turn-off to a long dead-end road into the hills. At the end of the road was the regional base for a notorious gang who held a lot of power in the area. We had been told by locals that they'd never had any trouble with them because they didn't like doing things in their own backyard, so to speak. But the night it happened, it was dark and it was snowing. I had changed for bed with my lights on and curtains open, never imagining that there would be anyone around to see me. I switched off the light, got into bed, and then it started. A deep, slow, raspy breathe in, a pause, then a deep, slow, raspy breathe out. And I froze. Then little tapping noises and more breathing. At first, I honestly thought that it was coming from my bedroom cupboard and was completely paralyzed with fear. Betty started barking and growling from the lounge room, and at that point, I just screamed. Mum came running in, and I told her about the noises. She told me that I was being ridiculous at first and that there was probably a possum outside. They make all kinds of strange noises, as some of you probably know. And so she said that she would take Betty out and scare it away. Two things to note too before I go on. Firstly, Betty was a very gentle, medium-sized dog who was about as terrifying as her name. She barely barked, and before that night I had actually never heard her growl. Secondly, my mum is pretty much a sweetheart and never really overreacts. So I heard her put Betty on the lead and open the back door. Then I heard simultaneously Betty making the most aggressive noises I've ever heard from an animal before, and my mum screaming, "Who the heck are you? No, no," and a scuffle, and then a loud slam. I ran into the corridor and could see my mum pale and terrified, and Betty with her teeth bared, snarling and trying to get to a man on the other side of the glass door. A huge man, covered in what looked like blood, with a disfigured face and a look in his eyes that was just... I'm trying to think of the right words, but evil is close. guess you could just say that it was obvious that he meant us harm. He started lunging against the door, even though Betty was making it pretty damn clear that he would have to get through her to get to us. I started screaming to call the police, which was actually pretty ridiculous given our location. Mum passed Betty's lead to my sister and ran for the phone screaming out, "I'm calling Jack, I'm calling Jack." Jack was the nearest farmer, but suddenly the man just turned around and just sort of loped off. Jack turned up about an hour later. He had come across the man who was clearly on some sort of drugs. In retrospect, I'm probably guessing meth, and had crashed his car into the ditch by the turnoff. Because the guy was apparently affiliated with the gang, and Jack valued his life, he had to help the guy to get his car out and send him on his merry way. And after that, we moved in with friends the next day and left the area within weeks. But there are so many unfortunate things about that night too, because firstly, Betty for sure saved our lives. Mum is a very small lady, and if Betty hadn't reacted the way that she did, he would have got into our house right away for sure. He actually didn't keep trying to get in. It was a flimsy door, and I know dog attacks are nothing to sniff at, but the guy was absolutely ginormous, and probably in drug-induced psychosis too, so I don't like to think about what could have happened if he'd actually gotten in. But thirdly, he either wasn't armed or somehow didn't think to use his weapon. And finally, he had gone back to his car to get a weapon, but thankfully, Jack and his shotgun found him first. This happened to me a few years ago, probably around mid-July of 2017, I would say. So, it must have been like 2 a.m, I think, and I was in bed sleeping when all of a sudden I just woke up. The room was completely dark except for some moonlight coming in through the window, and I got up to look for my phone and check the time. I turned my head towards the window, and in front of it I see this black figure just standing there, and occasionally moving its arms slightly, just like when an ordinary person will stand still and, well, move their arms. I looked at it for about 5 seconds and then pretended to go back to sleep, covering my head with my blanket and going into a fetal position as I started to shake and sweat cold. I peeked out of the blanket every 30 minutes or so to see if it was still there, and it just kept standing there where it was when I first saw it. Then after like 4 hours of this, I would say, I saw a light turning on in the corridor that brings to my room, and I just rushed for it, thinking it was my dad getting ready to leave for work. Thinking about it now, I don't really remember seeing anyone, and that's pretty freaky too, but I just stayed up for the rest of the night, sending messages to one of my friends on Discord, but he obviously didn't believe me. This happened 2 more times over the span of about 5 months, and each time too, it got closer and closer to my bed. The second time it was almost identical to the first, but it vanished after around an hour. And the third time I kind of got used to seeing it because I knew it wouldn't hurt me, but obviously it still scared me a lot. The scariest thing about this one encounter though was that it was so close that I could hear it breathe. And it sounded like when you breathe with your mouth while showing your teeth, and it sounded like really angry maybe. Before you ask, no, it wasn't a hat man, it was just a figure. Nothing horrible happened to me in the days following the events, and no, it definitely wasn't sleep paralysis. I could move freely and as much as I wanted. But what do you guys think? Do any of you guys have any experiences with anything like this? What was it, and do I need to be worried?